Buenas tardes y muy bienvenidos a esta sesión sobre la importancia del desarrollo de drogas huérfanos y tener incentivos. Es un placer de estar en este lindo país, de disfrutar de su cultura, pero va a ser mucho difícil de seguir después de esa valle de Mexicana. So I will switch to English now. Welcome and good afternoon and welcome to this 10th session about the importance to incentivize orphan drug development around the world. And as I just said, I think it will be quite difficult to follow after this great Mexican cultural program. I did ask my panel if they would be willing to go up and dance between the presentations, but they told me they were a little bit tired after the dancing we just did. So, with that, I would like to begin with the first presentation. And I will be making this presentation also on behalf of India Michaud, who is legal counsel at Hunton & Williams. We have prepared this presentation together, and I would also like to thank my Global Regulatory Affairs team for helping me with a lot of information about existing orphan drug incentives around the world. So I think we have already heard quite a lot about what the problem is these days in terms of developing orphan drugs and having sufficient orphan drugs available to patients. But just to recap very briefly, we know that 6 to 8% of the world population suffer from a rare disease, but actually less than 10% of pharmaceutical spending is invested in rare diseases today. So why are there so few orphan drugs? Well, of course, there are stringent requirements to authorize medicinal products, and that does make R&D programs a challenge, especially in small populations. And we all know the challenge about having small populations and achieving a return of investment. At the same time, as we've heard throughout the conference, more and more rare diseases are identified, and the problem is really intensifying because I think as we all become aware of these diseases and patients become aware that there may be a hope for a treatment, there is of course a growing pressure on developing and getting more orphan medicinal products to the market. And I think of course, it's not going to be a surprise to this audience that part of the solution to the problem is obviously to stimulate and encourage both research in rare diseases and development of orphan drugs. And how can we do that? This is also not a new question. It is already being done in some countries. We do have specific legislation for orphan drugs that include incentives for their development. And we do know that this exists, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what exists today. And we also know that some countries actively promote the treatment of rare diseases, but that actually real, solid orphan drug laws or regulations are lacking. And today we are faced with a situation where most countries actually do not have a specific orphan drug regulation or a rare disease program. And I want to be very clear on this point because I know that we've seen a lot of different information circulating, and there's also some very good posters out there talking about this. When I am saying that there are no specific orphan drug legislations, regulations, or laws, whatever they're called in their jurisdiction, I really mean that there are no laws that are dedicated to incentivize orphan drugs. That doesn't mean that there is nothing. There can be other sort of incentives embedded in other parts of the law, or there may be other incentives that orphan drugs can benefit from, but there is not that dedicated thought behind doing something very specific for rare diseases. So just to give you an overview of what typically are the common incentives that we see where there is an orphan drug regulation. And we have obviously throughout the development of an orphan drug, in some countries the opportunity to get support for that research and development with grants and also tax credits. Looking at the regulatory pathway, there are a couple of things that we observe that you can get additional regulatory support in terms of getting either waived or reduced fees, or you can get support with your development in terms of scientific advice or protocol assistance. We also have specific pathways that are open to orphan drugs, such as priority review, accelerated approval, and so on, but they are not necessarily dedicated to orphan drugs, but a lot of orphan drugs by definition might be able to benefit. And we also know that after the approval, there may be, in some cases, some incentives in terms of pricing and reimbursement, in that it is in some areas possible to have earlier access to orphan drug products, and conditions are provided that allow companies to make a return on investment, to make it worthwhile to develop further orphan drugs. And finally, but really last but not least, we have market exclusivity as an incentive, and I do want to talk just a little bit more about that, because it is really for industry the most important incentive in terms of protecting all the investment that goes into developing orphan drugs. And again, I'm not the first one to mention this, so I'll be brief, but really just to remind you, when you are entering research in a new disease, you do not have animal models, you do not know which endpoints will work. You have to also find the patients perhaps to understand what endpoints are important to the patients. So a lot of research and development really goes in beyond what is perhaps done for a more common disease. So market exclusivity that really allows companies to recuperate and get their return on investment is really very important. And the definition of market exclusivity is that a competent authority is not allowed or will not authorize the same or a similar product for the same therapeutic indication, unless that product would be able to show some clinical superiority over the existing therapy. So that really gives the first company to come out with an innovative orphan drug protection against competition. And we know of a few countries where this is a well-established reward, and it's well legislated to have a specific market exclusivity duration, which is then valid from the time point that the orphan medicinal product is approved. It does vary, so in the United States it's 7 years, in the European Union it's 10 years, that can be extended by 2 years if some pediatric development is done, and in Japan it is also 10 years. So in my next slides, I just wanted to give you an idea of what the world looks like today in terms of orphan drug incentives, and also, of course, importantly, where the gaps are. But let me start off with what we have. So we actually have several countries that do have a well-established orphan drug regulation, and I know this is small print and I'm not going to go through it, but I did just want to share with you that it's really a well-established orphan drug regulation in those countries with very clear incentives laid down in the law. And those countries, as you can read on the top, are the United States, where we've obviously had this legislation since a very long time already, since 1983. Then the EU, Japan, Australia, Switzerland, and one of the more recent countries to have made very clear designations in their law is Argentina in 2012. Moving on, however, and looking a little bit more at around the globe where things are emerging but perhaps not so settled yet, there is a handful of countries that you can see on this list here that actually have at least some incentives for orphan drug development, and some of them actually also do have an orphan drug law, but not a lot of them. If you look at the last column, which says data protective incentive, which is what I mean by market exclusivity, data protection incentive, there's actually nothing here except for Turkey that only has a draft regulation that is planning to have market exclusivity in their legislation. So although it's great to see that some countries around the world have started to put out laws or more incentives, it's a little bit concerning that market exclusivity doesn't seem to be one of the incentives, when we know that this is the most important incentive for industry to be encouraged to develop more orphan drugs. I did also have another slide. I grouped specifically, as we are in Mexico, the Latin American countries together. And here again, we can see that there are not, apart from Argentina that I already mentioned, there are not many countries that actually have a dedicated law. There are, again, some incentives, so please, I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying, and I think certainly in Mexico, the decree in the law that recognizes orphan drugs and rare diseases is certainly very important, but at the same time, I think having specific incentives laid down in the law that stimulate development, and again, we can look at this last column, data protection is rather empty. That is something that is lacking currently in Latin America as well. And then, just to summarize, the countries where we do not have any, well, when I say provision, I mean any law or any clear provisions that are really dedicated to orphan drugs. It's still quite a large list in Latin America. And looking at, in the next slide, the world map, you can see here in green the countries that actually have an orphan drug regulation or law available. In yellow are the countries that have a draft orphan drug regulation available, so something in the making. And then in blue are those countries where we have some official provisions from which orphan drugs can benefit, but which are not necessarily specific to orphan drugs. It could be benefits for serious life-threatening diseases, for example. So I'm not claiming that this map is absolutely complete, but I do think it gives a relatively good overview. And when you look at it, you could of course say, well, you know, just sort of mathematically, it seems like almost half of the world is covered, but of course it isn't when you look at the number of countries, because we have a lot of countries in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, which have nothing in place at all. So, to summarize, I think that the incentives that have been enacted both in, for example, the US and EU laws, have of course helped to give birth to an orphan drug industry and have increased the focus on rare diseases. However, though, we do see that there is, as of yet, a relatively small number of countries that really have adopted, based on that, on those precursor models, a specific orphan drug law. And there are even many fewer countries that have implemented specific incentives such as market exclusivity. So it's obviously important that we do continue to push and motivate and make people understand why it is important that we obtain more regulations and laws that provide incentives for rare disease research and orphan drug development around the globe. And I'm certainly hopeful that ICORD can be part of carrying that word. And I would just like to finish my presentation by saying that I think it's really our mission, and we need to make sure that governments consider rare diseases due to their serious, debilitating and life-threatening nature, and also the often unmet medical need, as a priority, and that we ask that they adopt specific scientific regulation and laws to incentivize both rare disease research, development of orphan drugs, and patient access to such treatments. And with that, I would like to conclude my part of the presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Jim Reese from the FDA. He's the Health Scientific Administrator and International Coordinator at the Office of Orphan Product Development at the FDA, as I mentioned. Dr. Reese has been for the past 13 years at the FDA. He was first in the review divisions of both biologics and drugs, and more recently at the Office of Orphan Product Development. Dr. Reese has a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Rochester, and he became an associate professor at the University of Toledo, doing both bench research and related clinical trial research. I'm very pleased. Thank you very much, Dr. Reese, for making it here. We very much look forward to hearing your experience from the FDA to incentivize how we can incentivize orphan drug development.
buenos tardes, and good afternoon. I want to thank ICORD and the local organizers for inviting me to this meeting. It's been very informative and a very pleasant experience. Muchas gracias. I'm the International Coordinator at the Office of Orphan Products Development. Our office's mission is to determine in the United States if a drug is being used for a rare disease or condition according to the law of the United States. I have no conflicts of interest, and although my statements are vetted, these statements are mine and not the formal opinion of the FDA. The objective of this talk is to describe the incentives that we provide to try and develop orphan drugs in the United States, with a specific focus on our designation process, and then I'll talk about the focus on the rare disease collaborations that we have underway. First, I'll say that in the United States, orphan products may include drugs, biologics, medical devices, and medical foods. When I was invited to talk here, I thought my talk would be for ICORD, certainly. And I thought, well, ICORD knows about what we do already, so I was going to try and find something new. And I intend to do that. I realize now that there's a number of people who probably don't know what we do. But it's nice because I was going to cover some of the legislation briefly, but it's been referred to already in a number of the talks, so that was helpful. We did have in 1983 the creation of the Orphan Drug Act, and this was an attempt by the government to make a law which would allow increased development of rare products for rare diseases. Industry was reluctant to invest in small markets, and so legislation was thought to be needed to induce more rare disease development. This law was driven, as I state here, by patients, and patients involved with children with rare diseases, families with rare diseases. They drove this law and forced it into and created its existence. In this law, we defined rare disease as a condition in the United States where where the prevalence was less than 200,000 people. Another caveat is that there's actually this part of the law that says if a drug is not going to be profitable, if it's not a formal rare disease, but people think that it might not be profitable and they can show that, you can also get it. But that's very rare situation, shall we say. The law created incentives for developing the drugs, the Orphan Drug Designation Program and the Orphan Products Grants Program. The Orphan Product Grants Program is actually not an NIH program. It's a specific program from the FDA. I just thought I'd point that out. It's a much smaller program. Later on, there was legislation for devices, and more recently for rare pediatric diseases were developed, and I'll address those later. First, we'll talk about the Orphan Drug Designation Program. Basically, the incentives that we provide are the following. The company can receive 50% of the clinical trial costs for the studies that are used to develop the orphan product in tax credits. They can receive a waiver of the marketing application fees, which are substantial now, reasonably substantial. And they may be eligible for 7 years of marketing exclusivity. We say maybe because it's not a guarantee when you get designation and get approved. We have to make sure nobody else has been designation. Those are details I don't need to go into. The point is, you're likely going to get it if nobody else has been approved with that drug for that disease prior to your approval. As you can see, this is a slide showing the marketing application fees, which started in roughly 1993 at about 100,000 or so, and in 2014